All right, bon dia. Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me well. My name is Nick. I'm from Sciaena, the NGO organizing this webinar. And let me just introduce the session and then we'll go on to the presentation. So with me is Daila, a colleague of mine in Sciaena who's helping preparing all of this. And Dr. Doris Soto, who has been kind enough to accept our invitation for this first of 5 webinars that we'll host dedicated to aquaculture. So a quick word, Sciaena is a Portuguese NGO dedicated to marine conservation. And although we work mainly in fisheries, marine protected areas, and marine litter, we are seeing the need to devote some time and some work to aquaculture, being that its relevance, it's becoming bigger and bigger, not only in terms of providing food worldwide, but as well as potential impacts and potential for sustainability in food production. So we're seeing the need that in Portugal specifically to start to do some work on this aspect, and hence came the opportunity and the idea to create this series of webinars dedicated to several issues in aquaculture. So basically we're going to have one per week starting today, dedicated to all kinds of issues like sustainability versus aquaculture, and then we'll have one just dedicated to the Portuguese reality in aquaculture, fish welfare, and the main ecological impacts of aquaculture. So that's going to be more or less the themes that we're going to have in the following weeks. In theory, it will always be on Thursday, but I ask you to pay attention to our social media because there might be some changes, but in theory, we'll have a webinar each Thursday. So please feel free to follow our social media to get these updates, and obviously join us in this webinars. So on this first one, we're lucky enough to have Dr. Doris Soto, who my colleague Daila is going to introduce, and a quick word on the format. So we're going to have first the presentation that Doris is going to share, followed by a Q&A session, all right? So everyone feel free, even during the presentation, you have a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. So you can drop any questions or comments that you have in that box, all right? We prefer that you leave it there instead of in the chat box, because it's just going to be easier for us to do the Q&A session, all right? Thank you. Go ahead, Daila, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Daila, and I'm going to introduce you to Doris Soto, our speaker for this first session of webinars on sustainable aquaculture. She's a former aquaculture officer at the FAO, and she's currently working at an interdisciplinary center for aquaculture research in Chile. So good morning to her, because in Chile the day just started a couple hours ago. Yeah, she'll be giving a broad view of the state of aquaculture and talking about the ecosystem approach for sustainable aquaculture intensification. As Nicola said, you can leave your questions in the Q&A box, and I hope you enjoy it. And whenever you want, Doris.
Thank you very much.
All right, so now you should be able to share your screen, Doris. I've made you, yeah, perfect.
Thank you,
so,
thank you very much, Sciaena. Thank you very much to Sciaena for your invitation. It's really a pleasure. So I will be talking about the role of ecosystem approach for sustainable aquaculture intensification. For some reason, this doesn't go. I'm not sure why. Okay, sorry. So I will very briefly discuss the current status of aquaculture worldwide, using the opportunity that FAO launched the State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture on Monday this week. So I will use some of their data. Then I will go very briefly about what we are talking about. What do we mean by ecosystem approach to aquaculture? And I will talk about the need for spatial planning in order to really move more sustainably into intensive aquaculture. I will ask some questions, whether are we prepared to do that? I will focus on some case studies we are doing in southern Chile, and I will finalize with some lessons learned what can we do from the science perspective in regarding the aquaculture management areas under the ecosystem approach. Well, as I said, last Monday, FAO launched the last review of the state of fisheries and aquaculture around the world. This is SOFIA 2020. The information here is belongs all the way to 2018 because it takes quite some time for FAO to put all this data together from the global perspective from all the countries. So it's a very rich and very interesting document. So I invite you to download it and read it. What you can see here, and it's very clear, is that capture fisheries has really achieved sort of a plateau, and it really doesn't move much. There is a tiny bit of an increase here, and according to FAO information, is due to a better management of the fish meal fisheries in the coast of Peru and Chile. So aquaculture here in two colors for inland and marine aquaculture, so you can see that inland is still much more important, is almost half of the total capture. But this is even more important. Fish consumption is growing faster than human population. So here we have the line for population increase in the globe, and here is fish consumption. This is increasing faster, and more the fish products are for direct food use than non-food use, like in the case of fish meal or fish oil, which is an indirect food use. This also is very interesting because, as I said, even though there is still a bit more capture fisheries, more food fish is coming from aquaculture. So the numbers today, aquaculture is accounting for 46% of the production. We believe that in 2030 is going to account for 46 is going to go to 53. But in terms of food fish consumption, today we have 48% from capture fisheries and 52 from aquaculture. In 2030, almost 60% of the fish we eat will come from aquaculture. So whether we like it or not, this is a trend. We don't know what's going to happen, after this global pandemic, but I doubt that things will change too much. So we have to be prepared and do our best. The other important piece of information is that most aquaculture still today comes from Asia, and most aquaculture comes from China. So you can see here the global production in China, in Asia, excluding China, in the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Oceania. So you can see that essentially all this blue here is aquaculture coming from China and growing very, very fast. This is also true in the Americas. You don't see this as well because you see that there's a decline on capture fishes, but these blue bands are increasing. The same in Europe, in other places. But the role of Asia is huge, and this is going to continue to be like that. And the projections for 2030, I already mentioned that. So it's the most likely scenarios the aquaculture is going to take it over, and capture fisheries is very unlikely to recover, even though some efforts are being made, and we hope this improves in the future, of course. This is the last slide I show from this SOFIA report, but this is a very important one because we see that fed aquaculture is growing faster than non-fed aquaculture. So you can see here these sort of bluish bars. This is fed aquaculture, and this is non-fed aquaculture, like the aquaculture of filter feeders, like mussels and clams and all these organisms that are not being fed with external feed. And so this is in a way a challenge and is worrying, but it has a reason, of course. Consumers tend to have more preference apparently for fish and for fed fish. I mean, clearly this is growing because there is a demand, because there is a market. So this is something we can also challenge in the future. So we have to keep it in mind. Well, aquaculture as a production process, this could have been the same picture if we, let's say we were talking about agriculture 500 years ago or more. The thing is, we have at least two extreme conditions that I already mentioned. We have the aquaculture that is using external feeds, like the typical fish farming in cages, you know, the sea bream, sea bass, salmon, and so on. And we have aquaculture that does not need external feed, like mussels, seaweeds. And therefore, it's very important to be aware of how much is coming in and source, where is that coming from, and how much is going out and where it's going, and beyond the product itself. So it's therefore very important to have ecosystem considerations, and we need to have that from the early planning process. Of course, one of the questions that we ask very often, and this is one of the great concerns about aquaculture, is where are the outputs going? Whether it is in pond culture or in cage culture, or even in mussel farming, because of course mussels are taking food from the plankton, from the ocean, but part of that is being sedimented below. And even in seaweed farming, there is a modification of the ecosystem, and we have to be aware of that. So the ecosystem approach to aquaculture is a strategy for the integration of the activity within the wider ecosystem, such that it promotes sustainable development, equity, this is a key word, and resilience of interlinked social and ecological systems. The ecosystem approach is not about the environment. It's about the way we do our things within the environment, the way humans are connected here. And the ecosystem approach is guided by three main principles. Aquaculture should be developed in the context of ecosystem functions and services, including biodiversity, with no degradation of these beyond the resilience. This is also very important. Aquaculture should improve human well-being and equity for all relevant stakeholders, and aquaculture should be developed in the context of other sector policies and goals as appropriate. So we have to integrate. Aquaculture spatial planning under the ecosystem approach is one of our key tools. Spatial planning, here we talk about aquaculture management areas and the siting of farms. And here we have to do it addressing the social, the economic, the environmental, and the governance elements. These are the three pillars. And these are the elements also of the carrying capacity. How much can we put in the water body, including the health, the environmental risk, and the risk imposed by external forcing factors to aquaculture, such as, for example, climate change. In most cases, aquaculture planning and management has focused on production within a very short time scale, and it has grown with limited or no consideration to the negative and cumulative and synergistic impacts of numerous farming systems, small and large, within one ecosystem. Very typically in Asia, for example, we tend to forget that if you have 1,000 small farms in a small ecosystem, you will have an impact, that it could be even bigger than 2 larger farms. So this is very relevant. The concept of carrying capacity has been increasingly addressed, especially in the marine cage fish farming and mussel farming, but more often focusing on individual farms. And certification systems, for example, in general, also focus on individual farms, and this is not enough. Much less effort has been done for inland systems. Why do we need aquaculture management areas? We need management areas that can be aquaculture parks, aquaculture clusters, or any aquaculture area where farms are sharing a common relevant water body or source. That they might benefit of a common management system, including minimizing fish health risk and environmental and social risk. We might also use this as an opportunity that individual farmers could not access. For example, joint access to feed, seed, technical support, access to markets, post-harvest services. So we can even minimize a greenhouse emission if we are able to manage things in a more integrated way. This is just a very small diagram from this manual we produced with the World Bank, FAO World Bank, on the different scales of management. You know, we have aquaculture zone, the very large zone. We also have aquaculture individual farm sites, and we might have management areas where we work together with the other farmers in a management plan. We can also do this for inland ponds, for example, for shrimp farming, for tilapia farming, for pangasius farming. And this is still really not being addressed very much, but it's also very important because they are added and synergistic impacts. Well, I will go very briefly through a case study we are working on in Chile. Chile is the second worldwide salmon producer and exporter. And here we have about more than 800,000 tons in 2017. Today it's a little bit more than that, but we are about that scale of production. This farming is done in marine cages, and the marine cages are normally located in the fjords and inlets of southern Chile, from what we call the 10 region all the way down to close to the very tip end of South America. And the farms tend to be more concentrated than the comparative situation in Norway. In this map to the left, we can see the spatial distribution of the production in 69 salmon farming neighborhoods. They are called aquaculture salmon farming clusters. And the colors indicate the biomass. So some of them have much more production than others, you know, for example, this one and this one and the yellow ones. And so we started to look at this, how this could affect the environmental and social performance. And this is a figure showing the increase in the production, and we see two bumps here. One bump, a decline in 2009, 2010. That was due to a disease that was very, very relevant, the ISA disease. And you can see the very important impact. But then the farming started even growing faster. And now we have a second bump here due to HABs, to harmful algal blooms that we have during the last El Nino event. So the sector is very important, but it's also very fragile, and the planning is absolutely necessary. Well, which are the main potential environmental impacts of fish farming in cages? To be very, very brief here, there are different kinds of impacts. I already talked about nutrients, and nutrients can either, coming from a farm, the feces and the excretion of the fish can either go away because the currents, or they can accumulate on the bottom. And both situations are no good. Even when you don't have anything below, the nutrients have not disappeared. They have gone somewhere, and we need to know where they are going. And the other important impact are the escapes, especially when we are talking about introduced species, like the case of salmon farming in Chile, and also the escape of disease and parasites. So all of these are relevant. Of course, also the interaction with marine mammals and other wild species is very relevant. Sorry. Well, as I said, most studies and norms and regulations focus on the local impacts of individual farms. So we normally measure what is under the cage, and you know, we have all kinds of modeling. This is a very useful paper produced by Richard Corner and collaborators in 2006, modeling of the dispersion under the cage, and of course we can understand this very clearly. But I insist that when there's no accumulation of material below, it doesn't mean that organic matter will disappear, or even inorganic matter. And this is also very relevant when farms are located in areas with good currents, because the problem is that it's possible that the accumulation of cage shadow is minimal, so there's nothing here. but all the material could be accumulating somewhere else, for example, on the deepest part of fjords. And then we could start creating or helping to create anoxic ecosystem. Therefore, we need to understand the carrying capacity of all water bodies where aquaculture is taking place, even if they are large and very deep, especially when they are very deep. So more relevant, very well integrated monitoring systems are needed. So this is just a very short summary of an evaluation we did last year with several Chilean institutions, including the Instituto de Fomento Pesquero, that has a very good oceanographic, environmental oceanographic monitoring system. It's called CHONOS, and there is a web page that you can have a look. And so we use a lot of their information to try to understand at least two parameters: the water renewal time of these fjords, whether, when we talk about the age of the water, I mean, the longer the water stays in some of the fjords and inlets, the more risk, the higher are the risk of eutrophication problems. And also, some fjords might have naturally more or less oxygen. And if we add more organic matter, we might be adding to this organic matter might using even more oxygen. So it's very important to try to understand how these ecosystems are behaving and whether we are adding too much additional pressure. So we use different environmental and other risk indicators for each aquaculture management area, and we use it for decision making. We have a sort of a policy oriented publication now on the webpage of our center, and we talk about ecosystem-based indicators. And so we use several of these indicators, like the accumulated production in a certain area during the past 10 years or 20 years, also related to the area. We use indexes of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus per area. We use this water retention time. We develop an hypoxia index and so on. And with this information, we work on risk assessment with simple risk matrices to understand, for example, the probability of eutrophication. And we can use this kind of risk approach with ecosystem indicators for different other impacts. For example, the risk of escaped fish. We use the same sort of approach in a study we did about 2 years ago, where we look at the accumulated biomass of salmon farm in different communes, putting together all the neighborhoods, all the aquaculture management areas, and we calculated the total nitrogen that is going out into the ecosystem for the past 10 years. So the dots here are is the nitrogen. So with that, we use this as an indicator to show how certain ecosystems and areas can be more fragile to climate change. That is, if you have an ecosystem with more nutrient accumulated, could be more fragile if you have a red tide, for example. So this is very, very relevant. The risk level information can also guide, for example, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture implementation. And this is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture implementation would, for example, work when we have fed fish and some of the food coming into the fish, and some of their feces and not eaten material and expression can go into the food web, and finally could feed mussels. So we will not lose any of the food, or we will lose minimal nutrients and will produce additional biomass. So this integration is being very popular. There is a lot of, there are many publications, but despite increasing interest in these INCAR approaches, the real implementation is really very low if we look the real information on aquaculture production today. So we are thinking more about implementation at the landscape scale. So it's not just the same farm that is producing salmon, also producing mussels, but that we put the salmon farms in a way integrated in the space with mussel farms, so we can better use the nutrients. So now we have been studying addressing mussel farming vulnerability to climate change, also through risk assessment and management. We are almost finalizing that work now, and we are using that same information to try to see how to implement some integrated multi-trophic aquaculture schemes at the spatial or the landscape scale, and we are working on this this year. And we hope to have some more concrete results by the end of the year. So I'm coming very quickly to the end. What we have learned from this very brief presentation is that, of course, we need science to support the aquaculture ecological intensification. And it's very important to have this ecosystem approach, also this aquaculture management area approach. We really need to understand the ecosystems where we are working. This science has to be interdisciplinary, so we have to learn how to link environmental, socioeconomic, and governance issues and objectives. It's very important to define the appropriate ecosystem boundaries where we want to develop a management plan. And this is a great challenge, especially when we are talking about aquaculture more in the open ocean or offshore. It's very difficult, but this is a challenge we will need to address, especially for mariculture. We need to improve understanding of the pathways of aquaculture outputs within the ecosystem. We really need to know where are the nutrients going, and that will allow us to better plan and integrate, and also make more the sustainability and the intensification of aquaculture a reality. And this is absolutely relevant to define current capacity, even from an operational perspective. Also, to define through open participatory process, we need ecosystem level indicators, and this has to be participatory so people understand what we are doing, even the same farmers, and why we are doing it, in order to try to understand better the performance and the impacts. And finally, this has to be informed by integrated environmental and social monitoring systems. We have the situation in Chile and in many places that there are many monitoring initiatives, but very often these monitoring initiatives are not talking to each other, and we could be much more efficient, so we need much more cooperation within science and also public-private cooperation. And I will end up here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very clear and very a very nice sum up of these last figures by the FAO, which we've been taking a look as well in preparation for this webinar. So thank you very much for it. I would ask everyone, if you have any comments or questions that you'd like to direct to Doris, please do so in the Q&A box. We already have some, so if you don't mind, we'll go straight to it, okay? So the first question comes from Sciaena. Just a second. Okay, so the question is, the first question is about the relationship between ecosystem and humans. So ecosystem approach seems to imply that ecosystems give services to humans, but should it maybe the other way around, since ecosystem gives us life at the same time? So how do you see how we can organize the fish sector, so the fish industry, if we do not want to reduce the amount of catch in aquaculture? So I think the question is more related to, should we maybe look at reducing the amount of fishing catches in aquaculture instead of looking for ways to enhance it? I think this is the question. It's a bit weirdly phrased. I hope it's the question you meant to ask, Sien. But I think you understood, Doris, please.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand the question, but one important thing that you can also see in this FAO report is even though aquaculture is increasing, the use of fish meal for aquaculture is really not increasing. And this is very interesting because it means that there are more resources coming from somewhere else. And there are big efforts to use byproducts for aquaculture feeds. And for some species, there is very little fish meal being used. For example, salmon has gone through incredible transformation from fish meal users now to terrestrial inputs. But still, we are using resources, and the challenge is how to do more, how to use more recycled resources, so we don't need to take more from the ocean. And another important challenge is how to better use directly, for example, sardines and mackerels instead of going through aquaculture. And that's also a challenge because the way we treat these resources, how do we bring them to in a food safety situation for human consumption. But I really think that in the future, we will get more and more feeds for aquaculture from microalgae, for example. There are many initiatives today and systems that are being better using carbon from the atmosphere in the ocean. So I think there are different initiatives today that will probably help to do this better. Of course, we can also increase our use of non-fed aquaculture, like mussels and filter feeders, which has other challenges. I mean, today with all the use of mussels have shells, and now we are taking lots of shells from the ocean through mussel farming. But then we're taking calcium, so we have to return this calcium to the ocean. So all types of feeding has challenges, and the ecosystem approach has to do with the recognition that we humans are part of the ecosystem. And I personally, I don't like the idea of thinking the ecosystem serving us. I mean, we have to try to live in a way that we balance our way of living with the rest of the organisms in this ecosystem. And it's not easy, especially because human population is too large, and that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. If I could just build up on that, on these resources that could come from recycled sources, could you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, today there's a lot of fish byproducts that previously they were going to waste are going to fish meal. Mm-hmm. That's an impressive amount of reusing of all this material. Also byproducts of other animals like chicken. In some places, in some regions, they cannot be used, but in some places it can be used if they are well done. Also byproducts from terrestrial sources. So the idea is that hopefully we will not waste any food, and mm-hmm. in the future, all the waste should go into feed again. I mean, these are great challenges, and there are economic barriers, but sure. We have to make an effort.
Please, Daila, go for it for the next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Isabel Sousa, and she's asking, what are the problems to implement the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture in this region?
When you talk about this region, you're talking about Europe or the Mediterranean, the Atlantic?
I guess she might have meant Chile, but...
Well, the problem is the same almost everywhere except in China. I mean, in China, they integrated aquaculture.
Sorry, Doris, just to confirm, it's Chile. Isabel sent a quick message. She was talking about Chile.
Okay. Well, as I said, in Chile, it's the same as in other places where aquaculture is new. It's very difficult because even in the Mediterranean, because you probably know better your own examples, the sea bream or sea bass farming and the mussel farming in the Mediterranean. A farmer knows very well how to do one thing, farm salmon or farm bream or farm sea bass. And the farming has to be more and more careful about biosecurity issues, very specialized. So it's very difficult that one farmer will do both things well. And we see that is, every time I talk to the salmon farmers, why don't you go integrated? Oh yeah, well, we have a pilot thing here, but it doesn't work because there are even biosecurity challenges. I mean, there are some regulations here that you cannot have mussels too close to salmon because there are issues about potential host to diseases. So it's not easy for individual farmers, and it's not commercially feasible because it's more expensive to try to do it, and also because the consumer will not pay a much higher price unless we educate much better the consumers to pay higher price for an INTA produced mussel or salmon. But you can do the landscape planning. So that's why you really need a more ecosystem perspective. Yeah. So this is something we are trying to do now. We have a student now that is trying to understand, the total mussel biomass and salmon biomass in different areas, and we are trying to assess how, the portion of nutrients that is going to mussels, for example, and this would guide the future policies regarding the landscape. How do we put this farming system in the landscape in a way that the nutrients are better integrated and not lost to bacterial respiration?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The next question comes from Gonçalo, who is actually the coordinator at our NGO. So he says, thank you for kicking off this series of webinars with such a great presentation. You mentioned the importance of equity in one of your first slides. Could you build up on that a little bit? Well,
that's a difficult issue, and we see that especially today with this global pandemic. The aquatic ecosystem in general are almost everywhere, especially the marine ecosystem, belongs to everyone. So, these are resources, that common resources, and this is good, but this is also bad because it's very difficult to regulate and control because there's no private property, and it's more difficult. And the problem with aquaculture and with the use of, for example, licenses to use a specific portion of water, that you can produce something, a product, and you could make a lot of money and so on, and it could be very good. But very often this is not very well shared among all the stakeholders, the ones involved in the production, the local people. So if I am let's say, if I am the governor of the region or a province, if the farming that is going on here does not produce more social benefits than costs, then it is not worth. And when we talk about social benefits, more and more we are trying to build a better world. We are trying to make sure that the social benefits are better spread. So intensive aquaculture has, in general, been very good at producing jobs, but sometimes and very often the equity in the income and the local distribution of benefit is not as good, and we have to be very aware and very careful. And again, we have to make sure that the social benefits, if the social benefits are lower, especially at local level, than the impacts, it doesn't make sense to have the activity. So we cannot have private ownership of the ecosystem with private benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're very right. And related to this, the next question is from Filipa. She's a student of marine biology, and she's saying that she just learned about fisheries and aquaculture she didn't know that aquaculture in open waters could have such a big impact on the environment, which she should have realized. So do you think the aquaculture farmers are thinking only on the small scale? And do you think that could be changed in a political and economical way?
Well, you know, I don't think that small scale is always good. I mean, really, the question is not the scale. The question is the current capacity of the ecosystem. So you could have 10 small farms in a small, very small farms in a small place, and the 10 will have a bigger impact than one larger farm. So it's not so much a matter of the scale. Perhaps the scale, the smaller scale in general tend to spread better the social benefits. And that's very important. And that's good of the smaller scale. So the impacts, whichever scale, will always be related to the capacity of the ecosystem to handle with the inputs. So for offshore aquaculture or aquaculture off the coast, there might be areas and currents where most of the nutrients are well used. I mean, in many cases, even in Chile, many of the farms are attracting other fish. So other, wild fish are feeding often, around the farm. So we know that some of the nutrients are being naturally recycled. They are going into the food webs. But we need to know more about that. We need to understand that better. And so we are really aiming for some tracers, some better traces of nutrients to make sure that the impacts can be managed.
Yeah. Next, another question from Isabel. Thank you, Isabel. She's asking a general question about seaweed cultivation. What's your take on that? Is it possible to insert it in the conversation of this integrated or more holistic approach to aquaculture?
Well, seaweed are fantastic. I mean, I wish we could use more seaweeds. I love seaweeds. We eat seaweeds here, but there are different problems. First of all, most of the seaweeds, I mean, especially in the FAO statistics, you can see that most of the seaweeds that are being farmed today are not for food. They are for gels and for pharmaceutical products. So a very large portion of seaweed production is not for food. Yet seaweed can extract lots of nutrients, so they can be, in that sense, very important, very useful. But one of the major problems with seaweed farming and with seaweed in production in general is that there is almost a monopoly of buyers. So there is a big control of the price. So here in Chile, in front of, I live in front of the fjord, the small farmers used to farm seaweed 30 years ago. And the price they are being paid today is almost the same price. So, of course, you don't want to be poor all your life. So if you can move from farming seaweed to farming fish or mussels, you will move because you don't want to be poor. Someone has to pay a better price. So I think we have to add much more value added to seaweed. We have to make bigger efforts to adapt seaweed to food. I think there's a lot of future for that, but there's not enough effort, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dala.
Yeah, some people are writing questions in the chat, and we're focusing in the Q&A box for now, but we'll address those questions in a bit. And the next question in the Q&A box is from Guillermo. The aquaculture nutrients dispersions through the marine currents can be beneficial for the marine wildlife, like seaweeds or filtrator species that can live near to the offshore aquacultures. So I guess he's asking if can be beneficial, the dispersions of nutrients.
Yeah, of course they can be. I mean, again, we have to think about, we always have a very anthropocentric view of the of the ecosystem, no? So we we have to think that they can be beneficial, of course, because other fish can use it, mussels can use it. For example, here in southern Chile, we have a big issue with sea lion, and there are several studies and there are several colleagues trying to understand why the sea lion populations are growing. And apparently some of the information shows that it's also due to salmon farming, because they have more nutrients, they have more fish, they can steal more fish from the farms and so on. But of course, if you remember, or some of you might know that there have been several experiments in the ocean to fertilize the ocean with iron and with other nutrients to increase the ocean capacity to trap carbon. And I think we need to learn more about that. I'm almost sure that farms sort of enhance the capacity of phytoplankton to grow. And that could be good, but that could also be bad if they grow too much. So it's all a matter of the right balance. So I love the first law of the thermodynamics. You know, the matter doesn't create or disappear; it only transforms. So it's all a matter of the balance. And if we have the right balances, I think the human population in the future will survive only if we find better balances. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
We need more information and better understanding.
Very nice. Next question, we'll go to the chat because we can see the times of the questions, so we can go in order. So it's from Luciano. Thank you, Luciano. The question is, how will the salmon industry in Chile be able to intensify without increasing the use of drugs such as antibiotics? How can Chileans face this challenge?
That's a big one. Well, of course, there are two answers to that. First of all, probably, I mean, this is my very personal view, probably we really need to have a more longer term perspective. I mean, producing maybe less, more safely in the long term. So less intense, less dense, because if, you know, we see that in our own study now that the larger is the biomass in a neighborhood, the more antibiotics you use. And so it's like the virus today, you know, you have more dense populations and the spread is faster. But some of the solutions are, I hope, on the way, you know, vaccines. And I think for some diseases, like in the case of Norwegian salmon, they have found good vaccines, so they don't need to use antibiotics. And for the anti-parasites, well, I have several colleagues that are working on vaccines for the parasites as well, using metagenomics and trying to understand the way the salmon attracts the parasites. So I think there are more environmentally friendly solutions. But again, probably we'll have to find a better balance between the production intensity and biosecurity and environmental risks.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from Kilian Toledo. He will be the speaker, one of the speakers in our second webinar next week. He says, thank you, Dr. Soto, for your talk. Regarding ecosystem services provided by aquaculture facilities, it seems that there's a trend in which more researchers are suggesting that aquaculture facilities may act as functional as MPAs. What's your view on this? Are environmental problems surpassed by those ecosystem services provided?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, and we have addressed this question in the past with some friends. I see that Rafaela Gubelo is also is looking here, is attending. Well, we have also seen this even here in Chile, you know, many years ago when we started to study the impact of escaped salmon, and we started to work around the farms. And very often we found around the farms species that you don't find anywhere else, because everywhere else you have the fisheries and we have a very strong fishing pressure. So in many cases, farm areas are not only accumulate nutrients, but sometimes they're also in a way refuges. So I think there is a potential for that, but again, we don't know enough about it. I think providing services, for example, mussel farming, we are now trying to understand how mussel farms can provide a service even for salmon farming. For example, creating some barriers to red tides, and of course, mussel farming and seaweed farming can take a lot of nutrients, so they can provide services. But we have to be aware of the sedimentation. But yet, there are many potential services around aquaculture. Aquaculture can also be very useful around marine protected areas if it's well planned, because the marine protected areas, you are not allowed for fishermen to come in. And this has been a very difficult problem in many places around the world, that we create marine protected areas and fishermen used to fish there, but you don't give them alternative livelihoods. I mean, it's very difficult to stop them to go there. So aquaculture could help a lot in that sense, especially non-fed aquaculture and well-planned aquaculture could help to create like real sort of protecting barriers around the marine protected areas to provide alternative livelihoods. So I think there is huge potential there that we have to explore more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the end, it seems it all comes down to this idea of well-planned and well managed and so on. But a lot of times it seems that the industry takes the first step to start producing in whatever area, not only aquaculture, and only then comes the time of actually, okay, if you want to do that, then we have to manage first. And it seems it's also always like this race of what do we do first? Do we start producing and then start managing, or do we actually create the management strategy for these areas? And the slide you showed about these aquaculture management areas is very interesting. I didn't know about this concept, so I'm looking forward to evolution on that sense. We have close to 10 minutes left, which should be enough to go over the questions we still have. The next one is from Isabel. What about farmers coming together at an ecosystem scale? So,
well, that's the ideal. That's the ideal situation, and we are being sort of praying a lot on this here in Chile. You know, how to bring the farmers to work together and to cooperate, not only among the farmers, but maybe to integrate with fishermen and with other farmers. But socially, still difficult because the reason you just said. I mean, the farming started with a license, which becomes a private property where you're going to farm, and at least in Chile, the salmon farming neighborhoods were created to address the diseases, you know, but not the environmental issues. And we are putting a lot of pressure to move from that concept to ecosystem managed aquaculture. So we have a really relevant aquaculture water bodies where we try to integrate all the users of these water bodies, even including the cities, because some of our cities have their sewage going into the sea. So we need to, and the farmers cannot do this alone. Of course, there is a role for the government and for the society, and we need to use our marine environment in much more integrated and collaborative way.
Yes. Next question is from Rafaela. I see that you know her already, and she will be also doing a presentation in 2 weeks for the third session of the webinars. She's asking, what is your feeling about the region 12 in Chile? Would it not be better to keep this region free with a high level of protection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The region 12 in Chile is the southernmost part of Chile, you know, Magallanes region. Well, but I think this region is already very protected. There are many very large marine protected areas in this region, while in the 10 region where we have more salmon farming, we don't have any marine protected area. And we are trying to push to have a marine protected area here, because otherwise we will never know which is the real impact of aquaculture, because we don't have anything else, anything to compare with. So the 12th region is very, in a way, is very well protected. Well, this is a decision that it has to be taken by the people living there, you know, by the local authorities. And the problem is everywhere in the world, you know, people have something to live. I mean, they need livelihoods. They need, and there are always alternatives, but some of the alternatives in that region might not be as good. I mean, there are some initiatives about mining. They talk about tourism, but for example, today, the only industry that will continue to provide jobs is aquaculture. Tourism disappear. So you don't leave anything to these people in these regions when you take tourism away. And also, we keep thinking that tourism is very safe, and unfortunately, I have seen with my very eyes that it's not that safe. So I don't have a clear answer. I think it's not for me to answer. I think the people of that region and the government should discuss what do we want, what do they want, how do they want to live their lives, and what is going to be their livelihood source, how you could choose the best to produce the less impact into the ecosystem. Yeah. So I hope the aquaculture industry doesn't grow more, but whatever it happens, it has to have a very good discussion and making sure that you compare the right things to make a right decision.
Yeah, I think that's transversal to pretty much all production industries at this moment, because we're reaching obviously a tipping point from all sorts of environmental aspects. So it's hopefully we'll have that discussion in aquaculture for sure. So coming to the last questions, we have just a comment from Isabel saying we need to have more market for seaweeds. Here in Europe, this is happening, luckily. And then a question from Laura. Thank you, Laura. Asking, thanking you for your nice presentation. And then the question is, what do you think could be possible tools that aquaculture companies could use to assess the environment in the long term?
Well, I think many companies are already doing some things, but I think here the government has an important role. Maybe even more than the companies. You always need an independent evaluation, also for transparency reasons, and also because, as I said, in most cases, aquaculture is using private property. I mean, public property with a private right of use. But the state has to protect the public interest. So I think it's important that the state has a role in the monitoring. I think companies should have, and many do, for example, doing some monitoring of the oxygen from the water column all the way to the bottom, and they could do a much more efficient management and precaution approach if you are looking at the condition of the oxygen on the water column or on the bottom. So I think farmers more and more should do that on their own to make sure that they can really keep the ecosystem as healthy as possible. And that's very important, but it's not enough. I think you still need to have the government or the state to have an independent evaluation.
The last question in the box, it's something that I think you have some background in. Lara is asking, how can aquaculture overcome the threats from climate change?
Well, doing better everything is making you resilient. I mean, we have done all these studies on climate change impacts on aquaculture, and I have learned several things. But there are two things that you always need to have. First of all, you need to have very good monitoring systems, and the monitoring systems have to be integrated to larger scale, but you also need local scale monitoring system, and you need the farmers to be aware and to be involved. So we need to have a much better understanding of the environmental conditions, even simple things, I think simple measures. A second condition is that we, more than ever, we need marine or inland protected areas, because if we don't have areas without the human pressure, we don't have enough information to separate the anthropic impact from the climate driven impact. So the need for areas without human pressure like fishing or aquaculture is important, so we can understand the climate change driven changes. But the most important thing is to do the best you can in terms of management. I mean, a system that is well managed, that is not stressed, where the fish are well fed, but they are not very dense, where you don't have diseases, will always be better prepared for any shock. And of course, there's a lot of research going on and needed in order to maybe select for more resistant species and so on. So there are several ways. Better management and good planning, risk-based planning is absolutely essential. With that, you already gain several points in adaptation.
Yeah, very, very good points, and very interesting, because it's a lot of the same things we talk about in fisheries, which is what our NGO works in the most. So this aspect of resilience and making sure that fish stocks are healthy and strong is a much safer prospect going into climate change alterations. So very, very interesting to know that the same concept is applied in aquaculture for sure. I think that's it from our side. This is coming perfectly into an hour of presentation plus debate. So I think we can call it a day. Thank you very much, Doris, for your time. It's been a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you to you. Thank you to you. I wish you the best with this series of talks, and I hope we'll see you again in the future.
Thank you very much. From our side, it's exactly what we wanted, a nice not abstract, but general discussion about aquaculture in general. So it was perfect. Thank you, Daila, for your help. And thank you, Doris, again, for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the afternoon then.
Thank you. And thank you to all the participants in your questions. See you next week, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.